Well, let's first take a look at this idea of whether different types of financial paper pay interest or not. So the obvious first example is cash, same as money. That's the stuff with the dead presidents, or picture the Queen. If you hold on to it for a year, what do you have? Well, there is no interest. How about a check? So the government sends you a check, a personal check. Somebody writes you a personal check, you keep it. Normally you take it to the bank and you cash it. But if you don't do that, you hold into it, no interest. How about a bank statement? That means to say you deposit money, you take your check and you deposit into the... These are all examples of financial. A bank statement, well, interest is very small interest, but it pays a little bit extra. That means it compensates you for the use of something while somebody else is using the real thing while you hold on to the financial paper. How about a bond? This is one we've seen, a government bond. Well, then it has maybe coupons, or if we have a pure discount bond, then you expect that the face value is going to be greater than what you pay for it, so you'll get some kind of a return. How about a stock or a share? Then they may pay dividends. Of course, it may not. And it may have a capital gain. That means the price may go up. Of course, it could also go down, in which case you would lose. So a gift card, let's take that example. I don't know how to write it up, but if you hold on to a gift card from a store, well, no, it doesn't pay any interest. However, imagine something like a coupon that gives you, which is the last point I want to make, is the distinction between real interest and nominal interest. All of these examples here, the nominal interest just means more cash. The real interest would be, for example, a coupon at McDonald's to get a free Big Mac. If you hold on to it, you don't get any benefit, but at least what it's going to give you in the future is something real. The distinction between the two issues of real and nominal is the inflation rate. So, for example, if I say I'm going to give you, let's say, $50 next year, 2 bottles of wine, well, you can go and buy the 2 bottles of wine, or if I promise you 2 bottles of wine next year and the price is 20, that price of wine hasn't changed, then there's no difference. But if there's inflation, the $50 next year may not get you 2 bottles of wine, it may only get you a bottle and a half. So the difference between the two is the inflation rate. As in this simple model we'll be looking at in this course, I'm going to try to keep the idea of inflation. I'll talk about it, but in general, you don't have to worry too much about it. But I will use the letter R for real interest rate and I for the nominal interest rate. Okay. There's 2 important characteristics of all financial paper. The expected return, what you expect to get back, which potentially could be negative, and then of course the risk of return, the chance that you may not get it. If you go back to my story of the laptop, is that I expected to get my laptop back, but of course the guy could have just disappeared or maybe broken it or put a virus or something on it. There's another aspect of financial paper that will become very important in this course, and it's referred to as liquidity. Liquidity is how easy it is to convert your paper into something that you really want, something real, or be able to trade it for something else. Because this notion of liquidity actually applies to more than simply real things. In general, I'm going to ignore risk in this course, but I will be looking very carefully at liquidity. To give you a bit of an idea what's at stake here and why return and risk and liquidity are very similar, is imagine you take, you take your coat. I think that's the Seinfeld episode. You take your coat to the dry cleaners. You want to get it clean. The guy says, come back next Thursday. The coat will be ready. But if, for example, you need the coat on Monday or Tuesday, well, what happens? You might phone and say, no, you said Thursday. That's an issue of liquidity. So it's a question of how easy it is to convert something into something else. And ultimately, it's a question of risk, because what's the chance that you may need something urgently? I often say probably the most liquid financial paper in the world is probably which in effect reduces the risk, is to have like a $20 US bill. A $100 US bill probably isn't too liquid because people might be afraid to take it. A $1 bill, I'm talking around the world, outside of the United States, a $1 bill may be just too small. People won't want to have it, but a 20, maybe a 10 or a 20, very liquid. Easy to get a taxi ride to the hotel with a $10 US anywhere in the world. Now, in our model, we've only got 3 types of financial paper, and I'll designate them by 3 letters. We've got shares equity, or stocks, same thing. I'll use the letter E. We've already seen government bonds, use the letter B, and now we'll be talking this particular lecture about M, money. You'll notice that these are all nominal variables. That means they're all they're all denominated in dollar terms or cash terms. So if I want to know a household's real wealth, in effect, the household can only hold this financial paper. I would take M plus B plus E divided by P, the price of yogurt, and that would give me W, which is their wealth measured in kilograms or liters of yogurt. Keep in mind, too, that households do not hold any yogurt. They consume it, but they don't hold it. That's K, but that's all given off to firms who bury it in a cave someplace as a form of investment. In return, the firms give the households this E, equity. And if I wanted to find out the K is a real value, so I take the physical capital stock of the entire society multiplied by the price of yogurt, that would give me the all households combined nominal stock portfolio. Now, move on to the idea of money. The first equation I'm going to introduce here is something called the quantity theory of money. Now, this dates from, well, actually it dates prior to Keynes, and certainly Keynes used it in his ideas for this macroeconomic models. And as I mentioned earlier, probably the three biggest innovations of John Maynard Keynes in his book, The General Theory, are, first of all, the whole approach of macroeconomics, but then secondly, the consumption function, as we've seen already, and then this third idea of the demand for money, or what's called the demand for money function. And he based it on this idea of quantity theory of money. Incidentally, this quantity theory of money is still frequently referred to in various newspaper reports and so on, so it's worth spending a bit of time discussing it. So let me go through these various letters here. First of all, we've got Y, which we know already as real GDP, which in our simple model is measured in kilograms or liters. The second thing we've got is the price of yogurt, let's call it dollars per kilogram. If you think of these two together, this is nominal gross domestic product. And in our simple model, it'll just be the price of yogurt times the quantity produced. But it's actually quite easy to measure in Canada because in this case, we're taking all the goods and final goods and services produced times the market price of all these items. Across all the various items added together, we get nominal GDP. So nominal GDP in our model, as well as in the real world, is actually quite easy to calculate. M stands for money cash that's been printed, issued, and is in people's hands at a given moment. When I say in people's hands, they're circulating the economy, if you will. And that's actually not that difficult to get data on. We can find out the Bank of Canada prints cash, and you think of it as literally the money sitting in your pocket or in a wallet and so on. The next variable is the notion of velocity of money. Now, what this refers to is how often, for example, a loonie is maybe spent during a year. How many times does a particular loonie get passed from hand to hand? One way of thinking about it. Note something here, that the nominal GDP is a flow variable, so we're looking at an effect like water flowing into a swimming pool, whereas the money cash at a given moment is a stock variable. So it's the level in the swimming pool. The reason that explains why we use the word velocity, because in effect what we're converting is a stock variable to a flow variable, and it requires velocity to do that. As I say, the notion of velocity of money is how frequently a loonie or a dollar changes hands in a given year. This issue of measuring money cash becomes a bit problematic in the real world. In our simple model, it'll be really simple. It's just M money. There's only three types of financial paper, which of two we only really care about, bonds and money. In the real world, it's a bit more complex, as we all know, because people use, for example, credit cards, they use gift cards, they use checks, there's bank statements, debit cards, now you guys use your phones. So there's a whole series of methods of And that poses a bit of a problem in terms of what do we mean by money or cash? And I'll be talking later about that in the next lecture. I want to take this idea of the quantity theory of money and apply it in the case of the United States and Canada. This is data I collected, I think, for 2014. Yeah, it's 2014. I put this in as 2014. I should really provide the sources for this because I got it from the Bank of Canada and I got it from the U.S. Federal Reserve, basic data. So nominal GDP in the two countries, you can see this is measured in, of course, in Canada it's measured in Canadian dollars, in the United States it's measured in U.S. dollars, and it roughly amounts to about, this is the equivalent of about 2 trillion Canadian dollars, and this is about 17 trillion, let's call it 17 trillion American. Now it's about a factor of 10, not quite, but, and of course there's different currencies. Now, then, easy to get that data. Then I got the amount of cash money, and this means like it's called M0 or M naught, sort of base cash money printed by the Fed and also the Federal Reserve, and also printed by the Bank of Canada. It's in billions. So we got 70 billion. These are dollars, $5, $10, $20 bills that are floating around in the Canadian economy. In the United States, it's about what I've got there about 1,300, about 1.3 trillion. So then I figured out, well, I just took the nominal GDP, divided by M, and that gave me the velocity. And you'll notice a discrepancy. In the case of the United States, it's about half what it is in Canada. So there's different ways to think about this. One way to think about it is if I took the Canadian velocity and multiplied it by the amount of cash in the US economy, we'd wind up with a much bigger nominal GDP. Just imagine I took 28.5 times this number here. Well, I'd get about 34. It's a huge number. Well, there's something funny going on there. That's strange. The issue here is, why is the velocity different between the two countries? And I don't think it's because Canadians use less cash than Americans do, or because Americans, we've got the same roughly banking system is different, but what I mean is the usage of cash and credit cards and debit cards and so on is roughly similar between the two countries. So I don't think this is the explanation. I think the real explanation is this number here. If you imagine that I could drop this number down, make this number smaller, be able to half, about 650 billion, this number then would double. Imagine I made this smaller, well, this number would get bigger, and then it would match up with this number. So in effect, what we're looking at is about 650 billion US dollars too much. What does that mean? Well, what we're looking at, in effect, is the size of the black market outside of the United States. Around the world, people don't use Canadian dollars when they're doing drug deals or something illegal, or there are a lot of countries where the banking system or the economy doesn't function properly, so they tend to use US dollars. They don't use Canadian dollars, and this 650 billion there is what we're looking at. So in effect, it means that the US government, the US Federal Reserve, has to print lots of money, not just for the United States economy, but also for the world economy. I want to take an ugly idea of quantity theory. I want to look at it in what we consider a dynamic version. And to do that, what I'm going to do is say, well, what happens if these variables change? But keep in mind, P is the price of yogurt, if you will. Y is real GDP. M is the amount of money cash printed. And velocity is the frequency at which money changes hands. So if I put this into dynamic terms, you'll notice how I changed this. I just said percentage change in P during the year. Let's say percentage change in Y, percentage change in M. Now, take a look at each one of these. The change in velocity is how frequency, in a sense what we're saying is how frequent do people spend their cash? How long does it stay in their wallets? Well, that's going to be, you guys probably, I say you guys, but young people generally use their phone or use a debit card or something. Older people probably still use cash. This is going to change over time, and it's going to be based on technology. In the year, next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, let's assume that it's more or less constant. That means to say, this, and along historical trends, isn't going to change much. It will change, admittedly, with technology. Change in Y, well, that's going to be the real growth in real GDP. Let's assume this is 2% per year, just a number. What we can say then is, if we ignore this discrepancy here, if you imagine that we change this by, say, 4% a year, well, let's pick another number. Let's say 5% a year. Then what we can say is, if real GDP is changing at 2%, then you'd expect 3%. And what's this change in P? Well, that's inflation. So the dynamic version of the quantity theory of money amounts to the very common idea that if a country prints too much money, you wind up with inflation. And that's probably going to be true in the long run, excluding this change maybe in velocity. And that actually becomes quite important in countries where they have high inflation. But bear in mind something that's very important, is that this quantity theory of money, Keynes adapted it. And the Keynesian model is true in the short run. And that's what we're going to look at now. Instead, I've given the famous quote of Milton Friedman, and it is, in the long run, it's probably true. Inflation in long periods of time, and we look back historically, it's generally because the country has printed too much money, greater than the growth rate of real GDP. Now let's take a look at the Keynesian version. This is the innovation of Keynes developing his idea of the demand for money. Once again, I've given the quantity theory of money. And I'll just rearrange things a little bit. I put the M on one side, the P here, and you'll notice it's exactly the same. What Keynes did, in effect, is he changed this 1 over V for, let me call this L. That's what he did. And what he's saying primarily is that the demand for money, and I haven't quite gone to that, but I will. Let's call this the amount of money, real terms divided by the price, is dependent on not just real GDP, but also the interest rate. And that's the innovation of Keynes. Remember that Y is real GDP. This is the nominal interest rate, and this is the big change with Keynes. And then in addition to that, he changed this idea of, now we're moving from X, this would be like ex post to ex ante. So this is ex post. We're looking at the amount of money in people's hands looking back in time, but here we're looking at it in advance. So we're asking how much money or how much cash would people like to hold? That's why I put this D here in real terms. And Keynes suggested it's based on real GDP, very much like the quantity theory of money. But in addition, it's also dependent on the nominal interest rate. And I want to look at what that means exactly. The idea here is that in a simple model that we've got, there are two types of financial paper. So when we talk about portfolio is a portefeuille. It's like you're carrying different types of paper. You have the possibility of holding on to cash or holding on to bonds. Cash is liquid. You can easily use it to purchase things. That's its advantage. Unfortunately, cash has no interest, unlike bonds. Government bonds, the other type of financial paper you'll hold, it offers interest, but it's not liquid. So that means to say the desire to hold on to cash is dependent on both the nominal interest rate and real GDP. Here I've drawn it, the idea here is that if the nominal interest rate is high, that means to say bonds would be more attractive. Cash is nice because it's liquid. But on the other hand, bonds offer higher interest rates, so you'd like to diminish the amount of cash you'd have. And this is what we call the idea of choosing a portfolio is the different types of financial paper that a person would like to hold. Here I've given an example. If the interest rate is high, the amount of cash somebody wants to hold is relatively small. If, on the other hand, the interest rate is low, the person would prefer cash better than bonds because cash is liquid, easy to spend. You can imagine this because at a given moment, the amount of financial paper in a person's wallet is a mix of the two. It can either be money or bonds. So if I say that the nominal interest rate is high, people don't want cash, then we could say, well, the amount of bonds people would like to have is going to be high. Such that, if you will, I3, this is going to be, let's call this bonds 3, sort of the money plus bonds equals the total amount of cash or the total portfolio available. Last point I want to make here is that, I've redrawn this another time, is that this shows us the situation for a given, let's call it a given level of real GDP. If by chance I increase the real GDP. So that means everywhere along this curve is GDP is constant. If I change the real GDP, that means to say people would like to hold more cash because they're going to have more transactions following the quantity theory of money. I'd have to draw a new curve over here, and I would say now this is M2 when Y is equal to 2, and this is when Y is equal to 1. The difference here is that I've changed the real GDP. So we can sort of draw it like this, is that we've got I, Y, I don't know if I put this in. If the demand for money, real money balances, as the textbooks would say, it increases if Y goes up, but it's negatively related with the nominal interest rate.